Emma sat motionless on the cold wooden bench, her small feet dangling above the polished courtroom floor. At 3 years old, she should have been laughing, playing, asking endless questions about the world around her. Instead, she existed in a bubble of silence that no one could penetrate. The Multnomah County Courthouse in Portland, Oregon felt like a fortress of sadness, with gray walls and darker intentions swirling around a child who understood nothing, except that her parents no longer loved each other. Her mother, Sarah, sat on one side of the room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd applied extra makeup that morning, hoping to look put together and capable, the kind of mother a judge would award custody to. But underneath the foundation and concealer were dark circles that spoke of countless sleepless nights. Nights spent worrying about Emma's well-being. Nights spent replaying the moment her marriage had fractured. Nights spent wondering if she'd made the right decisions that had led to this moment in a courtroom, fighting her own husband over their daughter's future. Her father, Michael, occupied the opposite side of the room, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. He wore an expensive suit. His lawyer had advised him to look financially successful and stable, but the tailored fabric couldn't hide the tension radiating from his body. He hadn't slept well either. His mind raced with thoughts of injustice, with the conviction that Sarah was trying to poison Emma against him, with the determination to prove that he was the better parent. The anger had become a constant companion, burning in his chest like acid, consuming his thoughts and coloring everything he did. They hadn't spoken to each other in 3 months, not civilly anyway. Their divorce had been bitter, filled with accusations and legal maneuvering, filled with moments of cruelty disguised as honesty. Sarah had claimed that Michael was emotionally unavailable and financially irresponsible. Michael had countered that Sarah was vindictive and controlling, that she'd turned their daughter against him. The lawyers, sensing a lucrative case, had encouraged every conflict, every harsh word, every devastating accusation. Discovery had become a weapon. Depositions had become battlegrounds. And Emma, innocent and small, had become a pawn in a game she couldn't understand. Somewhere in the chaos of their crumbling marriage, Emma had simply stopped talking. The child psychologist's report was damning. Selective mutism, severe anxiety, possible developmental regression. Emma had spoken her last words 6 months ago, simple words like mommy and juice. And then one day, the words simply ceased. It wasn't a gradual fatting. It was an abrupt shutdown, as if someone had flipped a switch in her brain and locked the door from the inside. No amount of coaxing, bribing, or gentle persuasion could bring them back. The pediatrician had ruled out physical causes. Hearing tests came back normal. There was nothing wrong with Emma's vocal cords or her brain function. The silence was psychological, a manifestation of a 3-year-old's desperate attempt to make sense of a world that had become chaotic and frightening. Teachers reported she sat silently during circle time, her small body rigid, her eyes staring at nothing. When other children tried to engage her, she would simply turn away or hide behind the reading corner. During music time, when most children sang along with enthusiasm, Emma's lips remained sealed. At snack time, instead of asking for her preferred crackers, she would point mutely at what she wanted. Her preschool teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had called Sarah multiple times, expressing concern that Emma seemed to be withdrawing further with each passing week. Her grandmother, Michael's mother, had visited Emma in Sarah's home the previous month and had been shocked by her granddaughter's condition. She'd sat on the edge of Emma's bed, holding the little girl's unresponsive hand, tears streaming down her face as she realized the toll that the custody battle was taking on her grandchild. "You and Michael need to stop this," she told Sarah bluntly. "Whatever you're fighting about, it's not worth destroying your daughter. Look at her. She's disappearing." But the custody battle hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified. Sarah's lawyer had filed a motion claiming that Michael had made inappropriate comments to Emma about her mother. Michael's lawyer had countered with claims that Sarah was denying him adequate visitation time. Motions and counter-motions multiplied like rabbits. Court dates were scheduled and rescheduled. The legal fees mounted into tens of thousands of dollars, money that could have been used for Emma's therapy, for family counseling, for anything that might have helped the child cope. Instead, it went to lawyers who saw the case as an opportunity for billable hours. Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the case files for what felt like the 100th time, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She'd been on the bench for 23 years and had presided over countless custody battles. She'd seen the worst in human nature, parents who used their children as weapons, who lied without hesitation, who hurt their own flesh and blood just to hurt their ex-spouses. But she'd also seen the best, parents who set aside their pride and pain to do what was right for their children, who remembered that their kids' well-being was far more important than their own anger or desire for revenge. This case, though, troubled her deeply. Something about it felt particularly tragic. In her years on the bench, Judge Morrison had learned to read between the lines of legal filings. The accusations felt exaggerated. The claims seemed designed more to hurt the other parent than to protect the child. The lawyers, she suspected, were encouraging every escalation, every harsh word, every damaging claim. It was a cynical assessment, but it was one born of experience and a growing frustration with a legal system that often seemed to profit from conflict rather than resolve it. The case wasn't about what was best for Emma. It was about what each parent wanted to prove about the other. The arguments had centered on job flexibility, income levels, and geographic proximity to extended family. There were debates about school district quality and neighborhood safety. The lawyers discussed custody arrangements like chess moves, suggesting that Emma could spend her weekdays with one parent and weekends with another, as if children were objects to be divided rather than human beings who needed consistency and security. No one was really discussing the most important person in the room, the silent little girl whose entire future hung in the balance. No one seemed to truly understand that Emma wasn't asking for the perfect home or the best school district. She was asking for her parents to stop hurting, to stop blaming each other, to remember that she loved them both and that their war was destroying her. The bailiff checked his watch. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. The weather outside the courtroom was gray and drizzly, typical Oregon spring. Judge Morrison had one more hour of hearing testimony and arguments before she needed to make a preliminary ruling. The judge was preparing to make a decision that would separate a child from half of her biological family, at least for the majority of the year, possibly for many years to come. Emma's therapist had recommended stability above all else, which meant one primary residence and visitation with the other parent. The weekly transitions that so many children of divorce experience would be the new reality for Emma, whether she could cope with them or not. Both Michael and Sarah wanted primary custody, convinced that the other was somehow unfit, convinced that they alone could provide the emotional security that Emma so desperately needed. The irony was lost on both of them. Their desperate desire to protect their daughter from the other parent was, in itself, the primary source of Emma's trauma. The courtroom felt heavy with the weight of permanence, with the finality of broken promises and shattered dreams. Emma sat on her bench, small and silent and invisible, while the adults around her discussed her life and her future in terms that had nothing to do with what she actually needed. She was there, but she was also not there, present in body but absent in voice, watching a game she didn't understand and couldn't participate in, waiting for someone to remember that she was still in the room. The court reporter sat at her station, fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to capture every word spoken in the courtroom. But she couldn't capture the silence. She couldn't transcribe the profound absence of a child's voice, the eloquence of muteness, the way that Emma's silence was actually screaming if anyone had bothered to listen. The courtroom door opened with a soft creak at exactly 2:52 p.m., and Officer James Rodriguez stepped inside, his uniform pressed and pristine, his badge gleaming in the fluorescent light. At his side, on a leather leash, walked Duke, a magnificent 3-year-old German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat that seemed to absorb the light in the room. The dog's ears were alert, his dark eyes intelligent and calm, and he moved with the purposeful grace of a creature trained for important work. Their arrival was unexpected, and for a moment the entire courtroom seemed to pause and reassess the situation. Officer Rodriguez was a man in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of service work, from seeing difficult things and responding with professionalism and compassion. He'd been with the Portland Police Department for 17 years, and for the last 6 of those years, he'd been partnered with Duke. Their bond was evident in the way they moved together, in the subtle coordination that suggested hundreds of hours of training and countless experiences navigating both the dangerous and the mundane aspects of police work. Rodriguez was known throughout the department as someone who cared deeply about his work, who treated his responsibilities with gravity and respect, and who had an almost uncanny ability to calm nervous witnesses and upset victims. Duke was no ordinary police dog. While he was certainly capable of the traditional police work, apprehending suspects, detecting drugs and explosives, tracking missing persons, he had been specially trained in what law enforcement professionals called victim support work. This meant that in addition to his more aggressive police training, Duke had been conditioned to recognize signs of human distress and to respond with calming, therapeutic presence. He could walk into a room full of traumatized people and somehow project an aura of security and safety. He'd been trained to make eye contact with upset individuals, to allow himself to be petted without responding with protective aggression, and to remain calm and grounded even in chaotic situations. The specialized training had taken months and required working with a trauma-informed dog behaviorist. Duke had been exposed to scenarios designed to teach him how to respond to human anxiety without amplifying it. He'd learned to lower his body posture when approaching someone who was afraid, to keep his mouth slightly open in a relaxed expression, and to breathe deeply and slowly, almost as if teaching anxious humans how to breathe through their own distress. It was remarkable work, and Duke had excelled at it, demonstrating an almost intuitive understanding of human emotional states that went beyond what most dogs were capable of. Judge Patricia Morrison looked up from her papers, slightly surprised by the interruption. She recognized Officer Rodriguez. He'd testified in her courtroom before, always professional and well-prepared. But the dog was unexpected. She raised an eyebrow questioningly, and Rodriguez gave a small, apologetic nod. He mouthed the words "witness support," a signal that made immediate sense. The judge gestured for him to approach the bench, and Rodriguez walked forward with Duke at his side, the dog moving with such precision that his paws barely made a sound on the polished floor. "Judge Morrison," Rodriguez said quietly, keeping his voice low and respectful, "I apologize for the intrusion. We have a witness scheduled to testify in the Hendricks case, the assault case from last month. Mrs. Patterson is extremely anxious about being in the courtroom and testifying in front of the defendant. I was hoping to have Duke here to help keep her calm during her testimony. Our scheduling showed the case should have been called by now." Judge Morrison nodded, understanding immediately. She'd dealt with anxious witnesses before. Courtrooms were inherently intimidating places, and for victims of crime, returning to a courthouse to face their attacker could be traumatizing. The presence of a calm, supportive dog could make the difference between a witness breaking down on the stand and a witness being able to deliver clear, coherent testimony. It was a legitimate accommodation, one that fell well within her authority to allow. "Of course, Officer Rodriguez," the judge said, glancing at her schedule. "Mrs. Patterson's case is scheduled for 3:30. Your timing is actually perfect. You can wait here, and Duke's presence shouldn't disrupt these proceedings." She gestured toward the back of the courtroom near the bailiff's desk. "You're welcome to wait there. And officer, I appreciate your thoughtfulness in bringing Duke to support the witness." Rodriguez nodded gratefully and moved toward the back of the courtroom with Duke. Protocol typically dictated that animals should wait outside in designated waiting areas, but Judge Morrison made a small exception in this moment. She recognized the dog's obvious training and calm demeanor. She understood the therapeutic value of what Rodriguez was doing. And she was, at her core, a judge who cared about people. All people, including nervous witnesses who needed extra support to access the justice system. Duke settled onto the courtroom floor with the ease of a creature accustomed to public spaces and formal environments. His body relaxed into a resting position that looked almost meditative. His head rested on his paws in a way that conveyed absolute peace and acceptance. His dark brown eyes remained alert, scanning the room with the subtle awareness that all working dogs possess, aware of everything happening around him but not reacting, not judging, simply observing and processing. Officer Rodriguez stood nearby, his hand resting near the dog's collar, a picture of calm authority. The other people in the courtroom, the lawyers, the court reporter, the bailiff, barely registered the new arrivals. They were too focused on the task at hand, determining Emma's future, litigating the endless points of contention in this custody battle. Sarah, Emma's mother, glanced briefly at the dog and then looked away. Dogs made her somewhat nervous. She'd been bitten by one as a child and had never fully recovered from the trauma. But this dog seemed different. There was something profoundly calm about the animal's presence. She felt her shoulders relax slightly, and she attributed it to relief at the distraction from the proceedings. Michael, Emma's father, didn't even seem to notice that a dog had entered the courtroom. His eyes were fixed forward, his mind racing with legal arguments and strategies. He was thinking about his opening statement, about the points he wanted his lawyer to emphasize, about the ways he could make Sarah look bad in front of the judge. The dog was simply not on his radar. But Emma noticed everything. Her eyes, which had been staring at nothing for the entire preceding hour, which had been vacant and distant and unreachable, suddenly locked onto the German Shepherd. It was as if someone had switched on a light in a dark room. Her whole body tensed, but not with fear, with curiosity. Her small hands, which had been folded passively in her lap, opened slightly. Her small head tilted with the kind of wonder that children naturally possess when encountering something new and interesting. The bench on which she sat suddenly felt less like a cage, and more like a launching point towards something undefined but compelling. There was no logical reason why she should respond to this dog. Emma had never had a dog. Her family had cats before the divorce, but nothing more. She'd had limited exposure to animals, yet something in her responded to Duke's presence with a recognition that transcended logic. It was as if every cell in her body, every shut-down part of her traumatized mind, suddenly recognized that here was something safe, something pure, something that existed outside the chaos and anger that had consumed her world. Sarah noticed the change immediately. She'd been watching her daughter's face for months, looking for any sign that Emma was still in there somewhere, still capable of connection and joy. The transformation was so dramatic that she found herself leaning forward slightly, her breath catching in her throat. Emma's face, which had been blank and expressionless for so long, suddenly showed signs of animation. Her eyes focused. Her body language shifted from resignation to attention. Michael also noticed but said nothing, his pride preventing him from acknowledging anything that might seem positive in front of his ex-wife. But internally, he felt something crack inside his chest. That expression on his daughter's face, he recognized it. It was the expression Emma used to have before everything fell apart, before the shouting matches and the legal threats and the sense that her world was crumbling. The lawyers continued their arguments, oblivious to the silent revolution happening on the bench where a 3-year-old girl had suddenly, inexplicably, come alive. They were discussing custody schedules and child support calculations and parental fitness. They were speaking in legal jargon and citing case precedents. They were doing their jobs, technically competent but fundamentally missing the point of why they were there at all. But Judge Morrison noticed. She glanced over at Emma and saw the change in the child's posture, the sudden intensity of her focus. She looked at Officer Rodriguez and saw that the officer had also noticed, his eyes shifting from the front of the room to the bench where Emma sat. A moment of understanding passed between them, the kind of wordless communication that occurs between people who recognize that something significant is happening. Duke remained absolutely still, his body language unchanged, his breathing slow and steady. But his eyes had shifted slightly to acknowledge Emma's attention. There was a gentleness in the dog's gaze, a recognition that this small human was reaching toward him across the space between them. The dog made no attempt to approach, made no sudden movements that might startle or overwhelm her. He simply existed in his calm, grounded, peaceful state, projecting safety and acceptance without any demand for reciprocation. Emma's small fingers gripped the edge of the wooden bench with surprising strength, and she leaned forward slightly. It was the first voluntary movement she'd made in the entire courtroom proceedings. It was the first sign that she was still present, still capable of response, still reaching toward the world despite her trauma and fear. Time seemed to slow down in that moment, as if the universe had conspired to create a bubble of suspended animation around a small girl and a dog in a Portland courtroom. Emma leaned forward further, her small fingers gripping the edge of the wooden bench with surprising strength. Her entire being had shifted toward the dog, as if gravity itself had redirected, and Duke had become the center of her world, the focal point of every atom in her body. Her previously vacant eyes were now laser-focused on the German Shepherd, tracking his every micro-movement, studying his face with the intensity of a scientist examining a breakthrough discovery. The 3-year-old's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid for months, a constant reflection of her underlying anxiety, began to slow. It was a subtle change, but Sarah noticed it immediately. She'd become attuned to every nuance of her daughter's physical state, every sign that might indicate whether Emma was coping or deteriorating. This shift in breathing felt significant. It felt like the first real change she'd witnessed in her daughter in half a year. Emma's shoulders, which had been hunched near her ears for months, a physical manifestation of tension and fear, dropped slightly. Her body language transformed from closed and protective to open and receptive. She was still on the bench, still in the custody hearing, still surrounded by lawyers and legal documents and the machinery of a failed marriage. But in that moment, she wasn't fully present in that reality anymore. She had traveled somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere where the chaos of her parents' conflict couldn't reach her. In that same moment, something extraordinary happened, something that couldn't be measured by psychiatric scales or documented in psychological reports, something that transcended the boundaries of what modern medicine claimed to understand about trauma and selective mutism. A connection formed between a traumatized child and a dog whose entire existence had been shaped by training to understand human pain. It wasn't the kind of connection that could be explained in clinical terms or reduced to neurotransmitter activity. It was something more fundamental, something that existed in the space between two beings who recognized each other's suffering. Duke didn't move toward Emma. He didn't break his resting position or call attention to himself. He didn't perform any of the typical dog behaviors that might seem engaging or entertaining. He simply looked at her, maintaining steady eye contact across the distance of the courtroom. And in that look was a kind of understanding that transcended species and language, that went beyond the boundaries of verbal communication. The dog's expression conveyed something that could have been translated into words like, "I see your pain, I see your struggle, I see that you're trapped in a world that doesn't make sense, and I'm here, I'm calm. You can borrow my peace if you need to. I'm not going anywhere." Emma's breathing continued to slow, becoming deeper and more regular. Her small body seemed to settle, as if she'd been holding tension for so long that she'd forgotten what relaxation actually felt like. The physical manifestations of her trauma, the rapid heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the hunched shoulders, were all beginning to ease in the presence of this dog's steady, unwavering calm. It was as if Duke possessed a kind of emotional contagion, a capacity to project peace so profoundly that anyone in his presence began to absorb it by osmosis. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of months of specialized training, of a dog behaviorist working with Duke to help him understand that his calm could be transferred to anxious humans, that his peace could become their peace if he held it steady and strong enough. But it was also more than training. It was something that seemed to come from deep within Duke's nature, some essential quality of his being that recognized trauma and responded with compassion. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She'd spent so much time angry at Michael, so much energy fighting about custody arrangements and parental rights, that she'd almost forgotten why she wanted primary custody in the first place. It wasn't to punish Michael or to prove that she was the better parent. It was because she loved her daughter with a fierceness that consumed her, and she wanted to protect her from pain and confusion, and the feeling that the world was an unsafe place. Watching Emma respond to the dog, watching her daughter actually respond to something, to communicate through her body language that she was still there, still capable of connection, was like watching a flower bloom in fast motion. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and hopeful all at once. The lawyers continued their arguments, their voices providing a backdrop of legal language and procedural formality. Your Honor, my client maintains that the defendant's work schedule is fundamentally incompatible with primary custody arrangements. We strenuously object to any characterization of my client as anything less than a fully committed parent. The words washed over the courtroom like white noise, important to the legal process, but utterly irrelevant to what was actually happening on that wooden bench. Judge Morrison looked up from her papers, sensing something had shifted in the room's energy. She'd been on the bench long enough to recognize moments of significance, instances when something real and true broke through the legal formalities and reminded everyone in the room what they were actually trying to accomplish. She set down her pen and observed quietly, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Officer Rodriguez stood quietly near the back of the courtroom, aware that his dog was doing what he'd been trained to do, providing comfort to someone in need. But even he seemed to understand that he should not intrude or draw attention to what was happening. His hand rested lightly on Duke's back, and his eyes shifted between the dog and the little girl, witnessing the profound transaction occurring between them. Michael felt something twist in his chest as he watched his daughter's physical response to the dog. Some small voice in the back of his mind, a voice that had been drowned out by anger and legal strategy, and the desire to win, began to whisper that he'd made a terrible mistake, that losing a custody battle would be painful, but losing his daughter to silence and withdrawal and emotional shutdown would be infinitely worse. He didn't allow the thought to fully form, didn't allow himself to acknowledge it consciously. But the seed had been planted. The court reporter's fingers paused over the keyboard. In 15 years of documenting courtroom proceedings, she'd seen countless custody hearings. They were usually filled with anger and conflict, with accusations and counter-accusations. But she'd rarely seen anything like this. A child suddenly coming alive, a room full of adults recognizing without speaking that something important was happening. The bailiff, a man who'd worked in courtrooms for 15 years and prided himself on his emotional detachment, felt something catch in his throat. He'd seen the worst in human nature, criminals, abusers, people who hurt innocent others without remorse. But he'd also seen moments of grace, instances where compassion and understanding broke through the darkness. This felt like one of those moments. Emma and Duke maintained their gaze for what might have been 30 seconds but felt like an eternity. The silence between them was profound, unbroken by the legal arguments that continued around them. It was the kind of silence that only exists between two souls who understand each other perfectly, who need no words to communicate what matters most. The silence said everything that needed to be said. You are not alone. Your pain is seen. Your struggle is witnessed. You are worthy of love and safety and peace. Emma's lips parted slightly, and for the first time in 6 months something that looked like peace crossed her small face. The tension that had been etched into her features, the constant anxiety, the fear, the confusion seemed to ease. Her eyes, which had been darkened by the shadow of trauma, seemed to brighten slightly. Her entire body language communicated a single message: I'm still here. I haven't disappeared completely. I'm still capable of connection. Duke's tail remained still, his body position unchanged. But his eyes continued to hold Emma's gaze with a steadiness that seemed almost sacred. The dog's calm was absolute, unshakable, a rock in a sea of chaos. And Emma, reaching toward that calm like a drowning person reaching for a lifeboat, began to feel something that she hadn't felt in 6 months. The possibility of safety, the glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely terrifying. The moment felt suspended in time, isolated from the proceedings around them, existing in its own space of grace and healing. In that instant, without any words being spoken, without any formal therapeutic intervention, something shifted in the courtroom. A child began to heal. A dog did what he was trained to do. And everyone present, whether they fully understood it or not, recognized that they were witnessing something important, something that transcended the legal arguments and custody disputes and parental conflicts. It was, in its essence, a moment of pure connection between two beings who recognized each other's pain and offered the only thing that really matters: presence, acceptance, and the quiet promise that neither of them had to face their suffering alone. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, the sound cutting through the almost meditative silence that had settled over the courtroom. Judge Patricia Morrison called the room to order and prepared to resume the formal proceedings. Lawyers shuffled their papers with the rustle of legal briefs and case files, preparing to continue their arguments with the mechanical precision of professionals who'd made their careers out of conflict resolution. One lawyer stood, adjusting his tie, ready to present another motion. The other lawyer checked her notes, prepared to offer a counterargument. The machinery of the courtroom began to grind forward once more, pulling everyone back into the gravity of legal procedure and parental disputes. The judge's voice filled the courtroom. We were discussing the matter of custodial arrangements and the testimony regarding Mr. Michael Patterson's work schedule. Counsel, I believe you were about to present additional documentation regarding. But Emma wasn't ready to let go of the moment. The connection she'd established with Duke, the moment of peace and safety she'd found in his steady gaze, had awakened something inside her that months of silence had suppressed. It was as if a locked door in her mind had been unlocked, and behind that door were all the words and thoughts and feelings that she'd been storing up, unable to express, unable to release. As the judge began to speak, as the lawyers prepared to resume their positions and their arguments, as the courtroom machinery continued to turn, Emma's small body straightened. Her hands, which had been gripping the bench, released slightly. Her eyes remained fixed on Duke, but her mouth opened. It was the first voluntary movement of her mouth in 6 months, the first time her lips had parted with intention rather than just for breathing. And then she did something that stopped the world. She raised her small arm and pointed directly at Duke, her tiny finger extended with absolute certainty and purpose. The gesture was simple, but it was weighted with significance. She was acknowledging him. She was claiming connection. She was saying, in a physical language that transcended verbal communication, that this dog mattered to her. Her mouth continued to open, and words emerged, real, tangible, audible words that hadn't been heard from her lips in 6 months. The words were small, barely above a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the courtroom, they might as well have been shouted from the rooftops. "Good boy," she said, her voice small but clear, cutting through the courtroom like a bell. 2 simple words, 2 syllables that contained within them 6 months of silence, 6 months of trauma and confusion, 6 months of a child disappearing into herself to escape the pain of her family's dissolution. 2 words that were so ordinary, so simple, that no one would have thought them remarkable under normal circumstances. But in this moment, in this place, with this child who hadn't spoken a single word since her parents' conflict had begun, these 2 words were nothing short of miraculous. The room froze. Every person in the courtroom, the lawyers, the judge, the bailiff, the court reporter, Officer Rodriguez, seemed to understand simultaneously that something extraordinary had just occurred. It was as if time had stopped, as if the universe had paused to acknowledge the significance of this moment. Sarah made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at her daughter in shock and overwhelming emotion. All the anger she'd felt toward Michael, all the legal maneuvering, all the arguments about custody and support and visitation schedules suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of this moment. Her daughter had spoken. The silent child had found her voice again. Sarah stood up from her seat, her body shaking with emotion, her hands covering her mouth as she tried to contain the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her. Michael's rigid posture crumbled. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes widened with the kind of wonder that only parents who have watched their child withdraw into silence can understand. He'd been so focused on winning the custody battle, on proving that he was the better parent, on defeating Sarah in this legal arena, that he'd almost forgotten why he wanted primary custody in the first place. He'd almost lost sight of the fact that the goal wasn't to win against Sarah, it was to protect and nurture his daughter. And now, watching Emma speak for the first time in 6 months, he felt something break open inside him. It was humility. It was recognition of his own role in creating the environment that had forced his daughter into silence. The court reporter's fingers hung suspended over the keyboard for a moment, and then resumed typing with renewed urgency. Even though Emma had said only 2 words, the court reporter captured every word of this unexpected moment. "Good boy," the transcript would read, a simple phrase that would become the pivot point around which this entire case would turn. Officer Rodriguez's hand moved gently along Duke's back, a gesture of acknowledgement and pride. The dog's own eyes were still fixed on Emma, and his body language conveyed a kind of satisfaction, as if he understood that he had completed his mission. The dog's tail, which had remained still throughout the entire exchange, began to wag, a slow and gentle movement that seemed to acknowledge the profound nature of what had just transpired. The wag was controlled and measured, not the exuberant tail wagging of a dog who'd just been given a treat, but something more dignified, something that seemed to convey understanding and acceptance. Duke understood, in the way that dogs somehow do, through instinct, through training, through some mysterious capacity to sense human emotional states, that he had helped someone. He had done his job not as a police officer's partner responding to crime scenes or tracking suspects, but as a healer, a bridge between a broken world and a child who needed to find her way back to language and connection. The dog's presence of mind was remarkable. He didn't jump up excitedly or try to approach Emma. He remained in his calm, grounded position, allowing her to have her moment without the distraction of his excited response. Judge Morrison removed her glasses slowly and set them on her desk. She stared at Emma for a long moment, seeing not a case number or a custody dispute, but a little girl who had just spoken her first words in half a year to a dog. The legal complexity that had seemed so important moments before suddenly felt hollow and irrelevant. The motions and counter-motions, the arguments about work schedules and financial capacity and parental fitness, all of it suddenly seemed beside the point. A child's silence broken, her voice returned. That was what mattered in this moment. Everything else would have to wait. The bailiff wiped his eyes quickly, trying to maintain his professional demeanor, but his emotional response was evident. He'd been present for countless custody hearings, had seen the damage that parental conflict inflicted on children, and yet he'd never witnessed a breakthrough quite like this. It was as if the universe had decided to intervene, to demonstrate in no uncertain terms that the legal battle was less important than the child's well-being. One of the lawyers, Sarah's attorney, had her mouth open in shock. She'd spent months preparing arguments and gathering evidence, all designed to prove that her client was the better parent. But now she realized that the most important evidence had just presented itself, and it had nothing to do with custody arrangements or parental fitness. It had everything to do with a child finding her voice again. Michael's lawyer was equally stunned. He'd been preparing to continue his vigorous defense of his client's custody claims, but the moment Emma spoke, he understood that the nature of the case had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer about winning. This was about supporting a child's recovery. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a moment of grace that none of them would ever forget. The moment hung in the air like a question mark, like the beginning of a new chapter in a story that had been written in silence for far too long. Emma had spoken. She had broken through the wall of mutism that had isolated her for 6 months, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but a moment of profound human healing. Judge Morrison's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet and measured. "I believe we need to call a recess. There are some matters we need to discuss in chambers." It was a simple statement, but it marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape this entire custody case, and more importantly, would begin the process of healing for a family that had almost destroyed itself in the pursuit of winning a legal battle. Judge Morrison called for an immediate recess, her voice carrying a note of authority that brooked no argument. The lawyers, confused and intrigued by the sudden halt to proceedings, began gathering their materials with uncertain movements. They sensed that something significant had occurred, but they weren't entirely sure what it meant or how it would impact the case they'd been building. One lawyer whispered to his colleague, "Did that really just happen?" The other lawyer nodded slowly, her mind already racing through the implications. Sarah stood so quickly her chair clattered backward, scraping against the polished courtroom floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Her eyes never left her daughter. She wanted to run to Emma, to scoop her up in her arms, to hold her close and never let go. But some instinct, some understanding that the moment was delicate and needed to be handled carefully, kept her rooted to her spot. Instead, she simply stared at her daughter, tears streaming down her face, her lips moving wordlessly as if she were trying to say something that had no adequate verbal expression. Michael also stood, his anger temporarily forgotten in the face of his daughter's breakthrough. He looked at Emma with an expression of such longing and regret that it seemed to age him by years. He wanted to approach his daughter to comfort her, to let her know that he was still her father and that he loved her. But protocol and uncertainty kept him in place. Instead, he watched his ex-wife, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel anger toward her. He felt only a shared recognition of what they'd both almost lost. Emma remained on the bench, her gaze still fixed on Duke, as if afraid that looking away might make the dog disappear, might break the spell that had allowed her to find her voice again. She was aware of the movement around her, the standing and the gathering and the emotional responses from the adults in the room, but Duke remained her anchor. The dog was her certainty in a world that had become profoundly uncertain. Officer Rodriguez carefully guided Emma's parents, their lawyers, and the court-appointed child advocate into a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. This was a space designed specifically for sensitive discussions, with comfortable seating and soft lighting that stood in stark contrast to the formal austerity of the courtroom itself. The walls were painted a soothing blue, and there were even a few pieces of abstract art intended to create a sense of calm. But no amount of interior design could counteract the emotional intensity of the moment. Duke remained in the courtroom with the bailiff, who seemed surprisingly moved by the dog's presence and content to let him rest on the cool floor. The decision to leave the dog behind felt significant. The focus now needed to be on understanding what had just happened and what it meant for Emma's future and her parents' custody arrangements. Officer Rodriguez glanced back at Duke before closing the conference room door, and the dog seemed to understand that his work in the moment had been completed. He settled onto the floor with a sigh that sounded almost philosophical, as if a job well done warranted a moment of rest. Judge Morrison took her seat at the head of the conference table, her judicial demeanor still in place, but her expression more open than it had been in the courtroom. She gestured for everyone to sit, and they complied, creating a semicircle around the table. The lawyers looked uncertain, unsure of whether they should still be operating in adversarial mode or whether this was something different. The court-appointed child advocate, a woman named Patricia Winters, who had years of experience working with children in custody disputes, leaned forward with focused attention. Dr. Lisa Chen, the child psychologist who had been observing the proceedings and was present to provide professional insight, sat at the conference table with an expression of stunned wonder. She treated many children with selective mutism in her 15 years of practice, but she'd never seen such a sudden and complete breakthrough. Her professional training told her that selective mutism typically responded slowly to therapy, over months or years, not in a single moment of connection with a dog. Yet there was no denying what she just witnessed. What we witnessed, Dr. Chen began carefully, her voice measured and thoughtful, was a child whose psychological defense mechanisms temporarily released. Emma's mutism was a coping strategy, her mind's way of protecting herself from the pain and chaos around her. When the nervous system detects overwhelming stress, it sometimes initiates a shutdown response. In Emma's case, that shutdown took the form of selective mutism. She couldn't process the conflict between her parents, couldn't make sense of the fact that the two people she loved most were at war with each other. So her mind essentially said, "If I don't speak, maybe I can make the pain stop." The psychologist paused, allowing her words to settle into the room. Sarah was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking as she realized the full weight of what her daughter had been experiencing. Michael's face had gone pale, as if he was physically absorbing the understanding that his conflict with Sarah had been so traumatic for Emma that she'd retreated into silence. But the presence of the dog, Dr. Chen continued, the non-threatening nature of the animal, the complete absence of judgment, it created a safe space where Emma's nervous system felt secure enough to attempt communication. Dogs operate in the present moment. They don't carry grudges or fight about the past or worry about the future. They simply exist, moment to moment. And that presence can be extraordinarily grounding for traumatized children. One of the lawyers, a man named Thomas who represented Michael, cleared his throat carefully. The question now is how to support her continued progress. If the dog is what unlocked this breakthrough, then the dog needs to be part of her therapeutic framework going forward, Dr. Chen finished. She turned to Officer Rodriguez, who had taken a seat at the edge of the conference table. "I'd like to learn more about Duke's training in trauma-informed support work. This wasn't random. Your dog was doing something very specific, something he was trained to do. But the connection he formed with Emma, that was something more. That suggested an almost intuitive understanding of what this child needed." Officer Rodriguez nodded slowly. He'd been working with Duke for 6 years, and he'd witnessed the dog's remarkable capacity to connect with traumatized individuals. But even he seemed somewhat awed by what had just transpired. "Duke has been trained in victim support since he was a puppy," Rodriguez explained. "He can sense anxiety and fear, and he responds by projecting calm. He's worked with assault victims, accident survivors, and abused children. But honestly, in all my years working with him, I've never seen a response quite like what just happened. That girl reached him on some level that transcends training." He paused, searching for the right words to describe something that was fundamentally beyond rational explanation. There's a concept in dog training called mirror neuron activation. Essentially, when a dog is very calm and grounded, that calmness can literally be absorbed by humans through a kind of neurological resonance. Emma didn't need therapy in that moment. She didn't need someone to explain her emotions or help her process her trauma. She just needed to be in the presence of something that was completely peaceful and non-judgmental. She needed to borrow Duke's peace until she could find her own. Judge Morrison, who'd been listening intently, leaned back in her chair. "So you're saying that the dog's presence literally helped calm her nervous system enough that she could attempt to communicate?" "Exactly," Dr. Chen affirmed. "Selective mutism isn't about not being able to speak physically. Emma's vocal cords are fine. Her language development is fine. It's a neurological response to trauma. When the nervous system is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, the language centers of the brain shut down as a protective mechanism. Duke's presence reduced Emma's stress hormones enough that those language centers could become active again. Sarah spoke for the first time since arriving in the conference room, her voice hoarse from crying. What do we do now? How do we make sure she keeps speaking? How do we fix what we've broken? Patricia Winters, the court-appointed child advocate, interjected gently. The first step is to understand that this isn't about fixing Emma. Emma isn't broken. She's responded exactly as we would expect a child to respond to parental conflict. The question is what we, as the adults in her life, need to do differently. Michael spoke, his voice quiet and full of regret. I need to stop fighting with Sarah. I need to put Emma first. I need to be a better father than I've been. Sarah turned to look at him, and for a moment, the anger and hurt that had been consuming their relationship seemed to soften. She nodded slightly. We both need to do better. The judge, who'd remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. I'm prepared to suspend the adversarial custody proceedings and instead mandate a new approach focused entirely on Emma's therapeutic needs. The conflict between you has created her trauma. We need to reshape this case around her recovery, not around determining which parent wins. It was a radical shift, from a traditional custody battle to a therapeutic model focused on the child's well-being. And everyone in the room understood, on some level, that they were being given a chance to rebuild what they'd nearly destroyed. Over the next week, the courtroom transformed from a battleground into a healing space. Judge Morrison made a preliminary ruling that shocked everyone who'd been following the case. She suspended the traditional custody decision and instead mandated a new approach focused entirely on Emma's therapeutic needs. The ruling was unprecedented in many ways. Instead of determining which parent would have primary custody, instead of calculating child support and visitation schedules, the judge ordered a complete restructuring of the case around one central principle: Emma's emotional recovery and her reconnection with language and safety. The adversarial custody battle would continue, but not in the traditional sense. The lawyers would still be involved, but their role would shift from attacking the opposing parent to collaborating on what would serve Emma's best interests. The legal system, which had been designed to pit one parent against another, would now attempt something far more challenging: to support both parents in becoming healthier versions of themselves so that they could both contribute to their daughter's healing. Officer Rodriguez began bringing Duke to Emma's therapy sessions twice a week. The Portland Child Therapy Center, where Dr. Chen had her practice, became the new center of Emma's universe. The office was designed to be welcoming to children: soft furniture, toys in carefully arranged baskets, drawings on the walls created by previous child clients. But what made it special was the way Dr. Chen had redesigned her approach specifically to accommodate Duke's presence and therapeutic work. What happened during those sessions was remarkable and documented by Dr. Chen with scientific precision. Emma, in Duke's presence, began to open up like a flower that had been closed against the cold, finally turning toward the sun. The progression was dramatic enough that Dr. Chen began taking detailed notes, aware that what she was witnessing might be valuable to the broader mental health community. The first session after the courtroom breakthrough was tentative. Emma sat on the floor with Duke, her small hand resting on his fur, and she whispered single words: soft, warm, nice. Her voice was barely audible, as if she was still testing whether words would actually work, whether her voice would actually be heard. Dr. Chen sat nearby, not pushing, not demanding, simply allowing Emma to set the pace of her own recovery. By the second session, Emma was forming short phrases: Duke is good, Duke is nice, Duke likes me. The dog remained calm and centered, his presence steady and grounding. He never demanded anything from Emma, never required her to interact in any particular way. He simply existed in his peaceful state, allowing the child to use his calm as a foundation for her own emotional regulation. Within 2 weeks, Emma was speaking in complete sentences. "I like Duke because he doesn't yell. Duke makes me feel safe. I wish Mommy and Daddy could be like Duke." These statements, simple as they were, opened windows into Emma's internal world that no amount of traditional therapy had been able to access. They revealed the depth of her understanding about what had caused her trauma, not her parents' divorce itself, but the conflict and anger and warfare that had accompanied it. The most profound breakthrough came during the 3rd week when Emma, sitting next to Duke in Dr. Chen's office, finally articulated the heart of her pain. "Mommy and Daddy don't love me anymore," she said, her small voice barely above a whisper. "They love fighting more than me." The statement was heartbreaking in its clarity, in the way it captured the child's fundamental misunderstanding about her parents' separation. Emma believed that her parents' conflict meant they'd stopped loving her, that the love had simply been depleted in the effort of hating each other. Sarah, observing from behind the one-way glass in the observation room, collapsed into Michael's arms. They both wept, not with anger or despair, but with the recognition that their child's pain was real and profound, and that they had caused it through their inability to contain their own hurt and rage. In that moment, something shifted between them. They stopped seeing themselves as combatants in a custody dispute, and started seeing themselves as co-parents of a traumatized child who needed them both to be whole and healthy. The impact of that realization was immediate and tangible. Over the following days, Sarah and Michael began communicating differently. They called each other not to argue or negotiate, but to share observations about Emma's progress. "Did you notice she spoke in complete sentences at breakfast? She laughed for the first time in months when the cat knocked over a plant. I think Duke's presence is really helping her." These conversations, focused on their shared love for their daughter rather than their conflict with each other, began to rebuild something that had been nearly destroyed: their ability to work together as parents. The custody arrangement that emerged from the court's new framework was unlike anything either lawyer had initially anticipated. Sarah and Michael would share physical custody equally, alternating weeks. But more importantly, they committed to co-parenting classes, individual therapy for both of them, and a binding agreement to never disparage the other parent in front of Emma. Judge Morrison made it clear that any violation of these agreements would result in losing custody time, a powerful incentive for behavioral change that went far beyond traditional custody enforcement mechanisms. The judge also ordered that both parents attend sessions with Dr. Chen, not as a couple but individually, to understand how their own unresolved trauma and conflict had manifested as destructive parenting behavior. It was a bold move, one that placed responsibility on the adults for their own healing, rather than simply determining a custody arrangement and hopping for the best. Emma's father became a regular presence at her therapy sessions, sitting quietly on the periphery while Duke worked his subtle magic. Michael began to understand that Emma needed him not as a combatant against Sarah, but as a source of stability and unconditional love. He started a journal documenting Emma's progress, which he shared with Sarah not as evidence in a custody battle, but as a way of celebrating their daughter's healing together. Creating this journal became a ritual for Michael. Each evening, he would write down the things he'd observed about Emma that day. How many words she spoke, what she laughed about, what seemed to comfort her. Sarah began doing the same, and the two parents started exchanging these journals weekly. It became a beautiful practice, a way of staying connected to their daughter's experience even when she wasn't physically present. More importantly, it gave them a shared language for discussing their daughter that had nothing to do with fault or blame or who was the better parent. By the end of the 2nd month, Emma had made remarkable strides. She spoke freely at home, at therapy, and increasingly at school. Her teachers reported that she was engaging with other children, raising her hand in class, and beginning to show the personality traits that had been hidden beneath the weight of her parents' conflict. She had opinions about things. She preferred chocolate milk to white milk. She liked playing with blocks more than playing with dolls. She wanted to learn about dinosaurs. These ordinary childhood preferences, which had been suppressed during her months of silence, began to emerge again. The selective mutism hadn't just loosened, it had shattered completely, leaving behind a child who was rediscovering her voice and her sense of agency in the world. Emma began to ask questions again, the endless why questions that are the hallmark of healthy childhood development. Why did mommy and daddy fight? Why do dogs not talk with words? When will I see Duke again? These questions, simple as they were, indicated that Emma was engaged with her world again, that she was no longer retreating into the protective silence that had isolated her. Officer Rodriguez noticed changes in Duke as well. The dog seemed to understand that his work with Emma was special, that this particular case held significance beyond his normal police duties. Duke's relationship with Emma became more tender, more protective. When Emma was in his presence, Duke would position himself in ways that made it easy for her to pet him, would lean gently into her touch, would make eye contact in a way that communicated understanding and connection. 3 months after that pivotal courtroom moment, Emma and Duke had become inseparable. The bond between the 3-year-old girl and the German Shepherd had deepened into something that transcended the typical human-animal relationship. It was a partnership born of mutual need and mutual healing. Emma needed Duke's calm presence to feel safe in a world that had become frighteningly unstable, and Duke seemed to understand, in some profound way that defied explanation, that this particular child required his focused attention and unwavering support. Officer Rodriguez began receiving special permission to bring the dog to Emma's home on occasion, allowing her to extend their therapeutic relationship beyond the clinical setting of Dr. Chen's office. The formal restrictions of the therapy environment gave way to something more organic and natural. Emma would sit on the floor with Duke in her living room, her small fingers running through his fur in repetitive, calming motions. The dog would rest his head on her lap, his breathing slow and steady, providing a kind of biofeedback that helped regulate Emma's own nervous system. Sarah and Michael, now engaged in genuine co-parenting rather than conflict, both agreed that Duke's presence was instrumental to their daughter's recovery. They began to understand, through conversations with Dr. Chen and Officer Rodriguez, that Duke wasn't just a pet or even just a therapeutic tool. He was a bridge, a living, breathing connection between their traumatized daughter and the possibility of healing. The impact of Emma's story spread through the Portland mental health and legal communities like wildfire, carried on the wings of professional networks and personal connections. Dr. Lisa Chen, with Emma's parents' permission and Emma's full knowledge that her story would be shared, began presenting the case at professional conferences and in academic settings. The presentation was titled Selective Mutism Breakthrough Through Animal-Assisted Therapy, a Case Study, and it captured the imagination of mental health professionals, legal advocates, and educators across the country. At the annual Pacific Northwest Child Psychology Conference, held in Seattle just 4 months after the courtroom breakthrough, Dr. Chen presented Emma's case to a standing room-only audience. She showed photographs of Emma and Duke together, with Emma's face blurred to protect her privacy, and walked through the clinical progression of Emma's recovery. She discussed the neurological mechanisms at work, the way that a dog's calm presence could literally alter a child's brain chemistry, reducing cortisol and adrenaline while increasing oxytocin and serotonin. But she also spoke about the mystery of connection, about the way that some therapeutic breakthroughs transcended what science could fully explain. The audience was captivated. Child psychologists wanted to understand how to replicate the results. Legal professionals in the audience began asking questions about implementing animal-assisted therapy in courtrooms. Social workers wanted to know if this approach could help with other forms of childhood trauma. The case became a touchstone in conversations about innovative therapeutic approaches, about the intersection of law and healing, about the power of animals to facilitate human connection and growth. Officer Rodriguez found himself becoming an unlikely ambassador for animal-assisted therapy in legal and therapeutic settings. He began consulting with courthouses and treatment centers throughout Oregon, helping them understand how properly trained animals could facilitate breakthroughs that seemed impossible through conventional means. He developed training protocols that other police departments could use to prepare dogs for this kind of therapeutic work. He spoke at law enforcement conferences about the dual role that dogs could play, both in traditional police work and in victim and witness support. Police departments in Washington and California reached out to ask about his methodology. Universities in the region expressed interest in funding research into the specific mechanisms by which animals like Duke could unlock selective mutism in traumatized children. A major university medical school asked Officer Rodriguez to participate in a longitudinal study examining the long-term outcomes of animal-assisted therapy in childhood trauma cases. But Duke didn't become famous or distant from Emma. On the contrary, the dog seemed to understand that his work with the little girl was his primary calling, even more so than his official duties as a police officer. Officer Rodriguez rearranged his work schedule, negotiating with the police department to modify Duke's duties to accommodate the ongoing therapeutic work. The department, recognizing the public relations value and the genuine healing that was occurring, agreed enthusiastically. Duke would continue to be available for police work when needed, but his primary function would shift toward therapeutic support. Duke became a fixture in Emma's life, a constant, reliable presence that asked nothing of her except companionship. When Emma transitioned from her mother's house to her father's house each week, Duke would be there waiting, his steady presence a reminder that some things remained constant even when her world felt unstable. Michael, who'd initially felt excluded from Emma's therapeutic process, began to understand that Duke's presence benefited not just Emma, but the entire family system. The dog's calm affected everyone. It created an environment where shouting and anger felt inappropriate, where peaceful coexistence seemed not just possible but natural. Emma's parents, transformed by their daughter's recovery, began looking at their own roles in her trauma. They sought individual therapy to understand how their own unresolved childhood wounds had manifested as destructive adult behavior. Sarah discovered that her tendency toward conflict avoidance in her own childhood had made her hypersensitive to Michael's emotional unavailability. Michael recognized that his own fear of intimacy, rooted in a distant relationship with his own father, had made him withdraw emotionally from his family during stress. They sought couples therapy as well, not with the goal of reconciliation, but with the goal of becoming more effective co-parents. Their therapist helped them understand that their divorce didn't have to be destructive, that they could model healthy conflict resolution and compassionate communication for their daughter. They discovered that the anger and hurt they directed at each other had created a chasm that nearly swallowed their daughter whole. The recognition of what they'd almost lost, what they'd nearly destroyed, became a powerful motivator for change. The case attracted the attention of Judge Morrison's peers. Several other judges in Oregon began asking about implementing animal-assisted therapy in their own courtrooms. What had started as an accident, a scheduling mix-up that brought a police dog into a custody hearing, was becoming a movement. The judge began consulting informally with other members of the judiciary about how to structure their courtrooms to accommodate properly trained therapy animals. Children's welfare organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest began reaching out to Officer Rodriguez, asking if he could help them train other dogs and officers for similar therapeutic work. A regional nonprofit focused on child advocacy approached him about creating a formal training program. Within a year, Rodriguez had developed a comprehensive curriculum that could be taught to police departments and other law enforcement agencies interested in training therapy dogs for use in legal and clinical settings. Emma became a symbol, though not in the way that most children in legal cases are. She wasn't a victim held up as evidence of someone's wrongdoing. She wasn't a casualty used to illustrate the damage of divorce. Instead, she was a beacon of hope, a little girl whose journey from silence to wholeness had illuminated a new path forward for countless other traumatized children. Her story demonstrated that recovery was possible, that healing didn't require expensive long-term therapy or pharmaceutical intervention, that sometimes what traumatized children needed most was the presence of a calm, non-judgmental being who could help them find their way back to safety and connection. And at the center of that transformation was Duke, a dog whose true calling had finally been revealed. The police dog who'd walked into a courtroom on a Tuesday afternoon had discovered that his greatest work wasn't apprehending suspects or detecting explosives. It was healing. It was connecting. It was helping broken people remember that they were worthy of peace and safety and love. Duke seemed to understand this in his own way. His bearing changed subtly. There was a sense of purpose about him, a recognition that his life mattered in ways that transcended traditional police work. The partnership between Emma and Duke became legendary in therapeutic circles, not as a cute story about a girl and her dog, but as a powerful illustration of how genuine connection could facilitate transformation that seemed impossible through other means. And for Emma, Duke wasn't just a therapy dog or a support animal. He was family. He was the being who had taught her, in a moment when she'd lost faith in the world, that safety was possible and that love, in all its forms, could find you even in the darkest places. 1 year after that transformative courtroom moment, Emma turned 5 years old. Her birthday celebration was held in the backyard of the home she shared with her mother during her mother's custody week, with the understanding that her father would pick her up the next morning for his week of shared parenting. The backyard had been transformed into a wonderland of decorations. Colorful streamers hung from the fence, balloons in every imaginable color dotted the landscape, and a large banner reading "Happy Birthday, Emma" stretched across the back of the house. A long table held cupcakes decorated with little dinosaur toppers, Emma's current obsession, along with fruit and juice boxes and all the typical fare of a children's birthday party. As was tradition now, a tradition that had become as essential as the birthday cake itself, Officer Rodriguez brought Duke to the party, much to Emma's visible delight. The moment she spotted the German Shepherd emerging from Officer Rodriguez's vehicle, Emma squealed with pure joy, a sound that made Sarah's heart soar. This was the sound of a child who was happy, who was safe, who had been healed from the trauma that had stolen her voice and her childhood joy. The other children at the party, neighborhood kids ranging from 3 to 6 years old, and classmates from Emma's kindergarten class, circled Duke with the kind of wonder that only children possess. They'd heard stories about Duke from Emma, had listened to her talk about "my special dog who helps me," and now they were seeing this remarkable animal in person. Emma proudly narrated the story of how Duke was her best friend, and how he had helped her find her words again. The other children listened with rapt attention, not fully understanding the depth of what Emma was communicating, but somehow grasping on an intuitive level that this dog was special, that he had done something important. One of the younger children, a 4-year-old boy named Marcus, approached Duke with some hesitation. Duke, understanding this child's nervousness through subtle body language cues, lowered his body posture and turned his head slightly away, a gesture of non-threat and invitation. Marcus reached out and touched the dog's fur, and his entire face transformed with wonder. Emma put her arm around Marcus and said, "Duke makes you feel safe, doesn't he?" The fact that Emma could recognize and articulate this about another child demonstrated how far she'd come. From a child who couldn't speak at all to a child who could recognize and validate emotional experiences in others. Sarah and Michael stood together at the edge of the backyard, watching their daughter laugh and play with unfettered joy. They had never reconciled as a romantic couple. That bridge had burned too thoroughly to rebuild. But their relationship had transformed into something equally valuable and perhaps even more important. a true partnership devoted to their daughter's well-being. They held hands quietly, a gesture that would have been unimaginable a year ago when they could barely occupy the same room without tension crackling between them, and watched as Emma and Duke played together in the grass. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Michael, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for finally understanding. Thank you for fighting for her instead of fighting with me." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sorry it took seeing her disappear to make me understand what really mattered. I'm sorry I put her through that. We both did, but I want you to know that I recognize my role in it, and I'm committed to doing better, to being the parent she deserves." "We're both going to do better," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "For her, and maybe for ourselves too. I'm in therapy now, working through why I responded to stress the way I did, and I think it's helping. I think I'm becoming a better version of myself." Michael nodded. "Me too. Dr. Patterson has been helping me understand why I withdraw when things get difficult, why I turn inward instead of reaching out. It's hard work, but it's worth it, especially for Emma." That evening, after the party had ended and Emma had collapsed into bed from exhaustion and happiness, her dreams likely filled with images of dogs and cake and the laughter of her friends, Sarah and Michael sat on the porch together. A year ago, they couldn't have occupied the same space without tension crackling between them like electricity. Now, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the evening light fade from the Portland sky, creating streaks of orange and pink across the western horizon. The silence between them was no longer laden with unspoken accusations and hurt. It had become companionable, the silence of two people who had fought through their worst selves and emerged with a deeper understanding of what mattered. They talked about Emma's upcoming kindergarten graduation, about her new love of reading. She'd become obsessed with books about animals, particularly books about dogs, about how she'd started asking when she could see Duke again. These conversations, focused entirely on their shared child and their shared love for her, had become the cornerstone of their new relationship. "We should establish something," Michael said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "In Duke's name, a foundation or something, a way to help other families like us, other children like Emma who are suffering from the effects of parental conflict." Sarah turned to look at her ex-husband with surprise and then a growing smile. The Michael she was looking at now was not the angry, defensive man she'd battled in court. He was someone who had done the hard work of self-examination and growth. "Animal-assisted therapy in schools and courtrooms?" she asked, understanding his vision immediately. "Exactly," Michael said. "Other families are going through what we went through. Other children are becoming silent like Emma did. If we can help them find their voice the way Duke helped our daughter, if we can help other parents understand what their conflict is doing to their children, then maybe something good can come out of all the pain we've caused." They spent the next 3 hours sketching out the framework for what would become the Duke Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding and implementing animal-assisted therapy programs in legal and educational settings throughout Oregon and beyond. They worked together, each contributing ideas, each building on what the other suggested. It was a collaboration born not of romantic love, but of shared purpose and shared redemption. They were taking the wreckage of their failed marriage and transforming it into something that could help other families heal. By Emma's 6th birthday, the Duke Foundation had already provided funding for 3 therapy dogs in courtrooms, one in Portland, one in Eugene, and one in Salem. 2 therapy dogs had been placed in elementary schools that served high-risk populations. One had been placed in a children's trauma clinic that worked with abuse and neglect survivors. The foundation had also funded research into the mechanisms by which animal-assisted therapy facilitated healing in traumatized children, partnering with a major university to conduct a longitudinal study that would follow children over several years. Officer Rodriguez became the Director of Training and Implementation for the Duke Foundation, developing protocols that other agencies could adopt. His work was recognized with several awards, including a commendation from the city of Portland for his innovative approach to community healing. He consulted with police departments throughout the Pacific Northwest, helping them understand how to identify and train dogs with the right temperament and aptitude for therapeutic work. Duke, now famous throughout the region, continued his work with perfect humility, seemingly unaware of the impact he'd had on so many lives. Emma kept a framed photograph on her nightstand, a picture of herself at 3 years old, pointing at Duke in the courtroom, her face transformed by the first glimmers of hope. Below the photo, a placard read in careful lettering, "The day I found my voice." She would trace her finger over the image sometimes before falling asleep, remembering that day when words had seemed impossible, and a dog had shown her that connection was always possible, that healing could come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful therapy requires no words at all, just presence, patience, and unconditional love. Years later, when Emma was old enough to fully understand the weight of what had happened, when she was a teenager grappling with the realization of how close she'd come to permanent psychological damage, she would volunteer with the Duke Foundation. She would visit children in courtrooms and schools who were struggling with selective mutism and other trauma responses, not as a professional counselor, but simply as a girl who understood. She understood what it felt like to be trapped in silence. She understood what it felt like to have your world crumble around you. She understood the specific fear of a child caught between two warring parents. And she would bring Duke with her on those visits, because some lessons can only be taught through example, and some healings can only happen when broken people meet creatures who have been trained to see them, to calm them, and to remind them that they are worth saving. Duke had aged gracefully, his muzzle turning gray, his movements slightly slower, but his capacity for healing remained undiminished. He seemed to understand that his work with traumatized children was his purpose, his calling, the thing that gave his life meaning beyond traditional police duties. The police dog who had walked into a courtroom on a Tuesday afternoon had done far more than support a nervous witness. He had changed the trajectory of a family's life, and in doing so, had sparked a movement that would help countless other traumatized children find their way back to wholeness and their own unique voices. His legacy extended far beyond the immediate family he'd helped. He became a symbol of what was possible when compassion met crisis, when a trained animal was recognized for its capacity to facilitate healing, when a system designed for conflict was transformed into a system designed for restoration. Emma would often think about that moment in the courtroom, that moment when everything changed. She would remember the silence that had consumed her, the way words had seemed to disappear completely, the desperation of being unable to communicate the pain she felt. And then she would remember Duke, his calm eyes, his steady presence, his refusal to judge or demand or condemn. And she would understand, in a way that transcended words or logic, that healing is possible, that love comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most transformative relationships are the ones we never expect, the ones that find us in our darkest moments and lead us gently back toward light. The end